Hello, everyone. My name is Madison Rodman. I'm an extension educator with Minnesota Sea Grant. Welcome to Twin Ports Climate Conversations. Today's talk will be about changing winter landscapes in the Lake Superior region, research, monitoring, and stories about ecosystems and outdoor activities. We'll have two presenters today, our very own Hillary Sorensen, who's a climate specialist with the 1854 Treaty Authority, and Natalie Chin, climate and outreach tourism specialist for Wisconsin Sea Grant. Minnesota Sea Grant is not the only organization responsible for TPCC. So we have a wide variety of groups and individuals involved with making these climate conversations happen. They are Wisconsin Sea Grant, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, the 1854 Treaty Authority, Minnesota's Lake Superior Coastal Program at the Minnesota DNR, and NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. TPCC has a broad mission. Its mission is to aid in improving climate change communication skills for all, improve climate change data and collection and sharing, the motivation and support of community-based climate adaptation, and increasing the climate change conversation in more sectors to broaden our impact. We also try to include and consider climate justice in each conversation. Throughout today's presentation, we invite you to consider our mission and help to contribute to our collective ideas and efforts as we work together to improve community resilience. We do have a variety of recorded conversations. So if this is your first climate conversations, we invite you to check out our back catalog starting in March of 2020. I'll be shortly posting a link to our climate conversations recording, so check that out in the chat box. Throughout our presentations today, we invite you to use that chat box to get in touch with me if you have some technical questions, or if you'd like to have a question to one of our presenters. So we'll moderate those questions, but if you have a question that pops into your mind, please feel free to include it in the chat box at any time. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Hillary Sorensen. Hillary is a climate specialist with the 1854 Treaty Authority, governed by the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa and the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa. Hillary's role is to implement the 1854 Ceded Territory Climate Change Adaptation Plan, completed in 2006, through collaboration with Bois Forte and Grand Portage and Fond du Lac. Prior to joining 1854 Treaty Authority, Hillary worked for Minnesota Sea Grant as a climate change extension educator. Her experience includes, or educational background includes a BA in International Studies in Spanish from the University of Minnesota Duluth, a master's in environmental studies from Lakehead University in Ontario, Canada, and a master's in marine biology from the University of Oregon, Oregon Institute of Marine Biology. Hillary grew up in Chicago and currently lives in Duluth, where she spends most of her time in and around Lake Superior with her dogs, Yeti and Ziggy. And with that, Hillary, I invite you to take it away.
Thank you, Madison. I was going to say good morning, everyone, but good afternoon. Daylight savings time has me all messed up here. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, how is that looking, Madison? Can everyone see the screen and hear me okay?
Looks great.
Thank you. All right, well, welcome to the March Twin Ports Climate Conversation. As Madison said, my name is Hillary, and I work with the 1854 Treaty Authority as the climate specialist. And today I'm going to be covering the Northeast Minnesota side of things, talking about changing winter landscapes and speaking mostly from the ecosystem perspective about how a changing winter is impacting beings on the landscape, as well as activities that we do during the winter months. And then Natalie's going to take over for the second portion and talk about the Wisconsin side. So I'll briefly give an introduction to who we are to those who are not familiar. For those who were not able to attend last month's Twin Ports Climate Conversation, Pete Boulay with the State Climatology Office gave a great presentation about changing winter weather. So I won't talk about that too extensively, but I'll just highlight some really local impacts. Talk about specifically winter and how changing winter is impacting ecosystems and beings and activities, and then introduce the 1854 Treaty Authority Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Plan and highlight some projects. So first, The 1854 Treaty Authority is an intertribal natural resource management organization that applies to the off-reservation hunting, fishing, and gathering rights of the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa and the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa. And this covers the territory, the ceded territory known as the Treaty of 1854. So this area is located in present-day Northeast Minnesota and covers 5.5 million acres. And our management, as I mentioned, is off-reservation, where we work with state, federal, and county and tribal partners on projects to protect and preserve treaty rights, those treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather. So for example, we have a wildlife program that conducts moose monitoring and wolf surveys. We have wild rice enhancement activities. We have a fisheries program, invasive species management, both terrestrial and aquatic, and we work on environmental projects. Now, where climate change comes into this is really as a kind of a stress multiplier, and one unique impact of climate change on treaty ceded territories and reservations is that these are fixed geographical boundaries. So particularly for Northeast Minnesota, where we have a lot of important boreal species that are already at the southern end of their geographic range, as the climate continues to shift and these species move out of this area and new species move in, that means that the tribal members are no longer able to access these culturally and ecologically important species and exercise their treaty rights. So several years ago, back in, I believe, 2015, Bois Forte, Grand Portage, Fond du Lac, the 1854 Treaty Authority, got together and started a project to develop a climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan that focused on this ceded territory. And we contracted out to Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments and Adaptation International to help with this process. And I'll get more into the plan a little bit later. But first, I'll just start with some basic. Step one was really to assess what changes we are already starting to see in this area. And this was known as a rapid climate assessment. So I'll just quickly go over some of the changes that we've been seeing to date. So this is for the whole Great Lakes region. This graph is from Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments, and this is looking at the time period 1951 through 2017. So we have seen an increase in average temperature by a couple of degrees. We've also been seeing a longer frost-free season or a longer growing season. And this one's going to be important for winter and those shoulder seasons of that transition from winter into spring. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. We have been seeing a general increase in precipitation overall by about 14%. But the take home from this is that a lot of that precipitation is coming in the form of heavy storms. And so we're seeing not only these heavy rainfall events, then followed by longer dry periods. So, and also seeing different forms of precipitation falling at different times of year. So in the winter, we're seeing some of that precipitation falling as rain instead of snow. This is just another really local example looking at the 1854 ceded territory, which falls into NOAA's Northeast climate region and East Central climate region. So for Northeast Minnesota, we're seeing those biggest temperature, minimum and maximum temperature increases happening during the winter. Same thing with East Central. And you'll notice that those minimum temperatures are warming faster than the maximum temperatures, those nighttime temperatures. So those are the changes that we've started to see to date. The second step of this rapid climate assessment was to combine emission scenarios, CO2 emission scenarios, with historic climate information to project forward about out to the mid-century to determine what types of changes we expect to continue in this area, and then to look at what those changes are going to mean for beings. So these graphs are broken out by season. And this is looking at the time period 2041 to 2070. And again, you'll notice that the biggest changes are happening during that winter season with the highest temperature increases and also precipitation increases by 10 to 20%. You'll also see that fall precipitation is expected to increase by that same amount. And we've seen a lot of this with some pretty big fall storms occurring in recent years. And then another thing to highlight here is not only these general temperature and precipitation changes, but also how that is impacting the timing of seasonal events or the phenology and when different beings are doing different things. A really classic example of this is observations of snowshoe hare starting to change their coat color and sticking out like a sore thumb because they're brown when there's snow on the ground and they're white when the snow has already melted. So things like that, as well as some other examples that we'll come to a little bit later on. A really stark seasonal change that we've started to see in this area and in Minnesota in general in the winter months is the duration of ice cover on both the Great Lakes and also inland lakes. So this is comparing sort of a broad overview. There's a lot of missing data here, but looking at 1980 ice out dates versus 2017 ice out dates. And you'll notice then in many parts of Northeast Minnesota, the ice duration difference is up to 2 weeks in some areas. This is just another really local example of that. This is from Pike Lake in Duluth, looking at the period 1960 through 2012. And ice duration did decrease by up from 2 to about 13 days. Ice was leaving the lake about 13 days earlier during those recent years. So why do these changes in winter matter? Why do we care? It actually sounds pretty nice to a lot of people that are not from Minnesota or Wisconsin to look at these warmer winter temperatures and think, well, maybe we'll be able to do more out there. But actually changing winter has a lot of negative impacts on the species and activities that we can do here, particularly those boreal species that I mentioned earlier that are already at the southern end of their range. So the second step to developing the 1854 ceded territory climate change vulnerability and vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan was to compile this vulnerability assessment. So keeping in mind the changes that we've already started to see in this area, we narrowed down to several categories listed on the left here and species of particular interest to the project team based on their ecological and cultural importance to the communities. As this process unfolded, a sub-team was identified for each of these categories, and then workshops were held to outline what those particular vulnerabilities were and develop adaptation strategies. On the right side on this graph, you'll see the vulnerability assessment results where over 30 species, groups, and habitats were identified, and then 11 particular focus species were pulled out to develop more detailed adaptation strategies for. And these are the species you'll see in bold here. Species and categories were ranked based on their sensitivity to climate changes that are already happening on the landscape, as well as their capacity to adapt to these changes, particularly moving into the future. So the species you'll see on the upper left in these greens and blues, these are going to be more generalists. So species like white-tailed deer, wolves, bald eagles, some waterfowl, they're going to do better under projected climate change, continued climate change. Whereas species that are a little bit more specialist in these pinks and reds on the lower right, these are going to be less able to adapt. They're already under stress from a variety of different factors. And then climate change acts as, again, that stress multiplier. So taking into account things like land use change, habitat loss, predation, loss of ability to access food, things like that. So species like moose, paper birch, boreal wetlands, northern white cedar, cold water fish species like cisco, lake trout and brook trout, these are going to be a little bit more vulnerable to climate change. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of these species that our program focuses on with the climate change adaptation implementation. The first one is going to be that I'll talk about is moose. So if you ask anybody in this area, they'll probably say something like moose is really central to the identity of the boreal forest. It's something that we incorporate in basically everything that we talk about Minnesota and wildlife. They're also very ecologically important. They help keep forests healthy. By consuming shrubs and trees and certain water plants. They are also an important food source for species like wolves, and they're a very important subsistence species. There's a lot of meat from a moose, and so they are really, really important to the communities, Grand Portage, Bois Forte, and Fond du Lac, and so they are also one of the most vulnerable species to changing climate. So some of the impacts to moose are going to be these warming winters. With warmer winters, although we may still be getting a lot of snow, we'll have less snow cover and snow pack because of warming temperatures, melting events, more rain falling during those winter months. So with less snowpack, we will see more winter ticks, and winter ticks are a big problem for moose in this area. Moose are also not very good at regulating their own body temperature, so thermal stress during the summer and winter is an issue for moose. They really rely on environmental factors to be able to control their body temperature, and so loss of habitat and wetlands and places in which they can cool down are also a major stress factor for moose. And then just changing forest composition, loss of some of these boreal forest species and wetlands. And then finally, under climate change, I mentioned that white-tailed deer are becoming more prevalent in this area. And white-tailed deer are a big parasite spreader to moose, including liver fluke and brainworm. So all of these factors, along with other stressors, make moose pretty vulnerable. And I promise I'm not just going to leave it on a negative note. I'll come back to some cool things that are happening. The second focus species that I'd like to highlight is walleye. So walleye are another very important food source for Ojibwe people in this area. They're more of a cool water fish species, but some of their prey are cold water, including fish species like cisco. They live and spawn in rivers and lakes or moving water and in shallow water, and they spawn in the spring shortly after ice out. So some of the effects from a changing winter are going to be that less ice on the lakes, or ice on the lakes for a shorter period of time, offers less protection from wind, rain events, and sedimentation. Water may also warm earlier in the season and be warmer for longer. And then there already are a lot of stresses on their prey species like cisco that have a very narrow temperature range. And so as these waters continue to warm, even by just a little bit, we're seeing more stress for some of those cold water fish species. And then another thing to keep an eye on with just changing winter is that ice duration, and if that is having an impact on the timing of walleye spawning, as well as their access to food. And then finally, the third particularly important species that a lot of our climate adaptation work focuses on is wild rice, or monomen. Monoman is an incredibly culturally important species. It's part of the Ojibwe migration story to this area where they follow the food that grows on water. It has been harvested for food for thousands of years. It is also an important ecological resource. It's food for food and shelter for a variety of different fish and wildlife species. Monoman is an annual plant that grows from seed each year. It grows in lakes and streams after ice out in the spring, and it needs shallow water of 1 to 3 feet and prefers some soft organic bottoms of lakes. The seeds ripen in the late summer or early fall, and the seed dormancy stage for Monoman is very important. It can last for years and also requires water temperatures below 35 degrees Fahrenheit. So Monoman is also one of those more sensitive species to a changing climate for a lot of the same reasons that many of our cool and cold water fish species are sensitive. With water warming earlier and being warmer for longer, this could impact that seed dormancy stage. There's also less protection again from wind, severe storm events, and sedimentation. So Monoman is quite sensitive to changes in both temperature and precipitation, but particularly when it comes in the forms of storms and increasing runoff. So those were kind of the ecosystem impacts taken from that vulnerability assessment. But what about activities that we do on the landscape during the winter months? This has actually been a really interesting year. As many of us experienced, wild ice skating was a thing up in many inland lakes, and also Lake Superior during December. These pictures were taken, this one of ice sailing was taken down by the airport on Park Point on the harbor side. And then many people could be seen on local lakes playing hockey and ice skating before we got snow. And we'll come back to some more pictures of that, but that lack of snow during that early portion of winter led to some really interesting ice formation on the lakes as well. Other activities that are impacted by a changing climate are things like dog sled racing. In recent years, the Bear Grease dog sled race has had to change their plans multiple times because of the unreliability of snow conditions. And then things like ice fishing, cross-country skiing, downhill skiing, snowmobiling, all of these things have had to shift a little bit in the timing and the length of time that people can participate in these. So one of the sort of tangential impacts from a changing winter in this area is shortening the season in which certain activities can happen, especially out on these lakes and trails. And also with changing temperatures, potentially more people coming up north to northeast Minnesota and northern Wisconsin to participate in these activities then creates more stress as well on the landscape, as well as safety issues of maybe people who are not from the area coming up and going ice fishing, maybe too early or too late and running into some ice safety problems as well. So those were kind of those are the bad news. Those are the impacts that we are experiencing and paying attention to. The third and final step was to develop adaptation strategies that would then go into this climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan. So over 270 adaptation strategies were developed, with more detailed adaptation strategies developed for those 11 focus species, including the ones we've talked about, moose, walleye, and Monoman. And each of the adaptation strategies can be broken broadly into these 5 categories. So collaboration, conservation, preservation, maintenance, education, monitoring and assessment, and restoration. And I won't go through these, but these are just some quick examples from each of those species that I talked about earlier as well. So now I'd just like to highlight a couple of projects from starting to implement this climate adaptation plan, and then just share some examples of that and then some next steps. So one of the things that we have been doing for a few years now is monitoring ice throughout the 1854 ceded territory. So during the winter months, typically December through March, sometimes April if we're lucky, we make it out to 10 lakes, trying to get a pretty broad geographic distribution to track ice thickness. And not only are we looking at total ice thickness, but also the different types of ice on the lake. So how much of it is going to be that clear solid ice like we saw this year where we didn't have snow creating that slush layer over the top versus other times of year or other years, how much of that ice is that gray slushy ice. We're also looking at snow cover on the lake and snow cover on shore. And again, trying to get more of a time series for how ice thickness and different types of ice change throughout the season and over the years. And then this year, we started to add in some snow monitoring. So I mentioned earlier that though precipitation is projected to increase during the winter months, and we will be getting a lot of snow, we may not see that enough snowpack remaining on the landscape. So we'll get a bunch of snow and then it'll melt, or maybe it'll rain. And so we wanted to get a better sense of how snow depth is also changing and getting a broad distribution across the area as well. So near each of these lakes where we track ice, we have also begun to set up transects that are 200 meters long, and every 50 meters we measure snow depth. And in the future, we're interested in expanding that to not only look at snow depth, but also snowpack conditions, including water content in the snow, density, and the crust layer that forms on the top to see how that could be impacting species moving on the landscape. Aside from monitoring ice and snow, we are tracking the timing of seasonal events in a variety of different categories. So on 2 of the wild rice waters that we monitor, we have installed time-lapse cameras since 2018 to track ice on and ice off, wild rice growth, storm events, and waterfowl presence. And I'm not going to play this video for the sake of time, but if you go to the 1854 Treaty Authority YouTube page, you can find these time-lapse videos, and they're really great for particularly tracking the timing that ice forms and leaves the lakes. At these same locations where we have the time-lapse videos, we have also been installing acoustic recorders in recent years to listen for frog and toad calls, to also look at the timing of when are these amphibians starting to emerge, and also looking at diversity of species. And then this is another really great year for this example, but we have started to look at the sugar maple sap run phenology. And I'll put in a plug if any of you are sugar maple harvesters and would like to share information about how this season has been going. We have been working with harvesters to collect information about the timing that the sap run started, how the sap is flowing, as well as environmental conditions like weather and snow depth when folks are out there. So my contact information will be on the last slide in just a moment. And if you're interested in sharing some information about that, please contact me. And then besides these monitoring activities for phenology, we have been compiling a yearly climate summary broken down by season, where we compile data from 14 weather stations and regional climate centers. And we also contribute to the community collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. So finally, we have some things coming up on the horizon. I mentioned that we're going to be expanding our snow monitoring program to not only track snow depth, but to look more at snowpack conditions across the ceded territory. And then a promo for next month's Twin Ports Climate Conversation. We will be hearing from Stephen Handler with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, who will be sharing information about a project through the Superior National Forest to look at assisted migration as a climate adaptation tool. So seeing what species we may be able to start to source seeds from more southern locations to preserve and protect some of these ecologically and culturally important species on the landscape. Okay, with that, I will stop talking. And I think we have a few moments for questions. Madison, I can stop sharing my screen as well.
Thanks, Hillary. So we do have time for 2 quick questions here before our next presentation. So if you have a question for Hillary, you can feel free to type it in the chat box, or I'll watch. You can use the reactions button. If you click that, you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you and you can ask your question verbally. So I'll give you a few seconds to type your question. And I'll just kick it off since I don't see any right now. Hillary, you mentioned you're monitoring ice depth, and you've done that for a few years. Are you monitoring ice quality along with that as well? So monitoring kind of that clear ice versus the gray slushy ice. Do you have any trends now, what you're seeing with ice quality?
That's a really good question. We only have a few years of data. I think this is our 4th year, and so no like real clear trends as of yet. Other than that, there's a lot of variability. I know that's not a wonderful answer to give, but I mean, this year was a really great example. We had very little snow, but it got cold. So the ice formed and it formed that really nice, clear, solid layer. Versus, last year, I think we had mostly slush on top of, a few inches of clear solid ice and then just a slush layer. The other thing about the ice monitoring is that we're only measuring one location on the lake. So the caveat is that that's definitely not representative of ice on the entire lake. And so, as if people are thinking about safety or going out there, but I think with a few more years, we might be able to have some pretty cool trends to share.
Great. Yeah, we'll check back in 2025 for some trends on ice quality. So I'm seeing a chat that's come in from Karen. Karen asks, is the document mentioned ready as a resource for watershed planning? The strategies would be useful for local water management plans and other watershed engagement actions. And I think Karen might be referencing your climate adaptation plan, perhaps?
Yes, so the climate adaptation plan is available. It was published in 2016. It's available on our website, and I'll make sure to put a link to it in the chat here. And then also we have the climate summary reports that have been since 2017, 2018, I believe. And those are also available on our website. So I can put a link to those in the chat, but yes, they are available to use to help with planning efforts.
Perfect. So we'll take one more question for you, Hillary, and this one comes from Kristen. And Kristen asks, you mentioned the breadth of adaptation strategies included in the plan, 270. That's a lot. Have you been thinking about prioritizing these or which to pursue first?
Yeah, that's definitely a big one. A lot of the initial projects that came, right when the plan was completed, were building off of what partner organizations or, tribal resource management programs were already starting to do. So when we did our climate adaptation plan, we didn't have to start from scratch. For example, Grand Portage was already in the process of developing their own climate adaptation plans. We were able to kind of build from that. And then a lot of the projects that we tackled first had to do with, one, those 11 particularly important species that were of more focus during the workshops, and then two, what projects were already kind of in the works and that partners, state agency and other tribal partners were working on.
Thanks, Hillary. So if there's time after Natalie's Q&A, we'll invite others to ask additional questions to you. But now we'll move on to our second presenter, Natalie Chin. So Natalie joined Wisconsin Sea Grant back in August of 2019 as the Climate and Tourism Outreach Specialist based at the Lake Superior Field Office in Superior, Wisconsin. Her work is focused on creating actionable science for stakeholders across the Great Lakes, especially related to climate change and tourism. Her educational background includes a BS in Biological Resources Engineering from the University of Maryland, College Park, a master's in Public Policy from George Mason University, and a PhD in Agricultural and Biological Engineering from Purdue University. Natalie grew up in the DC area and has been enjoying getting to know the Twin Ports over the last 18 months with her dog, Jackson. And with that, Natalie, please take it away.
Great, thanks, Madison. Okay, let me just pull up my slides. Okay, how does that look?
Looks great.
Okay, great, thank you. Hi, everyone, and thanks to the rest of the TPCC planning team for allowing me this platform to share some information about the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, also known as WICI. more specifically the work of the working group that I'm co-leading, which is focused on tourism and outdoor recreation and what some of our preliminary results say about winter. Okay, so before I jump into that, as Madison mentioned, I'm still pretty new to my position, so I just wanted to give a little bit of background about myself in the way of an introduction. So as Madison said, I started my position in August of 2019. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Minnesota Sea Grant and probably also Wisconsin Sea Grant. But our organization is set up a little bit different from Minnesota. Most of our staff is in Madison, Wisconsin, but we also have field office specialists based around the state, including myself. And so as Madison said, I'm based at our Lake Superior field office. And that office has a regional focus of the 4 Wisconsin Lake Superior counties of Douglas, Bayfield, Ashland, and Iron, though I also work beyond this geographic area. And so I work broadly on issues related to climate change and tourism but in terms of topical areas, this is kind of a new position for our program. So I've spent much of the last 18 months trying to figure out what it makes sense to work on, doing some networking and also working to develop the program. So I'm still figuring some things out, but a few of my current appointments, which might be of interest to this group given our current conversation today, include an appointment to the Wisconsin Department of Tourism's Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee. And this committee advises the department on efforts to address its strategic plan imperative of fostering positive travel experiences for all. And this includes by identifying and creating initiatives that help ensure that the Department of Tourism is taking the lead in developing a Wisconsin travel experience that welcomes everyone. I also wanted to mention that I'm a member of the National Extension Tourism Network's design team, and the National Extension Tourism Network works to integrate research, education, and outreach within cooperative extension and sea grant programs to support sustainable tourism. And this group has more of a national focus. I'm presenting at a Thursday webinar, so if you're interested in learning more about NET and its work, I can provide more information about that. And then outside of my official role, I also just wanted to mention that I'm a relatively new member of the Duluth Parks and Rec Commission. So if you ever want to talk about local parks and rec issues, let me know. Okay, so before I jump into wiki work related specifically to tourism and outdoor recreation, I wanted to share some broader background about the effort because I'm not sure how many folks in the audience are familiar with it. I don't believe that we've touched much on wiki as part of these conversations. And so the mission of wiki is really to generate and share information that can foster solutions to climate change in Wisconsin. And wiki works to do this through 3 primary objectives. And these are to develop scientific understanding of climate change impacts, to identify vulnerabilities to climate change and climatic variability in the state, and also to help enable successful problem solving through decision support. So wiki was originally formed in 2007 by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Nelson Institute of Environmental Studies. And so the Nelson Institute had been approached by several state legislators who wanted to understand the impacts of climate change on their constituents. And then the DNR staff wanted to understand impacts on the state's natural resources so they could make better management decisions. So the partnership was kind of a natural fit for both organizations. And so after its inception, wiki quickly grew to include many other people from other state and federal agencies, including several UW system schools, tribal organizations, businesses, and nonprofit organizations. And through the work of this collaborative network, wiki published an assessment report in 2011, which remains available on the group website and provides a comprehensive overview of how climate change will impact the state. So if we fast forward to 2019, Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers issued several executive orders that highlighted his administration's emphasis on climate change. And one of these executive orders, specifically number 52, tasked the Wisconsin DNR to work with wiki to update the 2011 assessment report and also provide information to a newly formed governor's task force on climate change. So Wiki, after a period of relatively low activity, though it never completely disappeared, ramped up its efforts again and prepared an updated report with climate change information, including impacts and possible response strategies for the task force. And so Wiki submitted that report to the task force last year, and then subsequently, the governor's task force issued a report for Governor Evers' office at the end of last year, which contains a series of recommendations for climate action for Wisconsin. That report, which was also based on input gathered from a series of public meetings, is available on the task force's website. And then that Wiki report, which you can see here, submitted at the end of July, is available on the Wiki website. So there's a lot more that could be said about Wiki and its work and these reports, but kind of the main point I'm trying to make is that the work of Wiki continues, and since providing this information to the task force, Wiki has now shifted its focus from updating the 2011 assessment report by the end of, shifted its focus to updating its 2011 assessment report by the end of this coming summer. So Wiki is it's structured as kind of an informal, decentralized network with a series of different working groups. And there are currently over a dozen different working groups that are focused on different focus areas, or that have different focus areas, as you can see here. Several of these groups are new since 2019, and those are highlighted in red on the slide. And this includes the Tourism and Outdoor Recreation Working Group. Yeah, so the Tourism and Outdoor Recreation Working Group, again, it was a group that didn't exist for the previous assessment report, but which I worked with Drew Watermullen at the Wisconsin DNR to convene at the end of 2019. And the goal of our working group is really to understand how climate change will impact tourism and outdoor recreation activities across Wisconsin, and also to develop resources and initiatives that support the sector's mitigation and adaptation activities. So our group brings together representatives from academic, government, industry, and tribal groups, all of which have diverse subject matter insights and expertise. And for more information about that working group, you can also visit the Wiki website. And so since our group is new, the primary goal that we have right now is to develop kind of a new report that matches what exists for the other groups that were around in 2011. And again, specifically focused on tourism and outdoor recreation, of course. And so given the focus of our talk today, I'll share some of what's in kind of section 2 of our report, which is comprised of kind of an overview of existing literature, both Wisconsin-centric and beyond, that helps us understand what climate change might look like for the state and region. And I'll summarize kind of information specifically related to winter, and also talk about some next steps. Okay, so again, if you joined us for our TBCC last month, you got a really great overview of climate trends for Minnesota. And if, unsurprisingly, those are similar for what's going to happen in Wisconsin. And Hillary also did a great job of highlighting how some of those impacts are going to affect beings in Minnesota and this region. But since it's been about 10 years since Wiki's original assessment report, the Climate Working Group recently completed an update of the climate science for Wisconsin, based on the additional last 10 years of historical data, plus new global climate model output. So kind of the high level summary of that work that highlights kind of 3 key points that I'll touch on today are that Wisconsin is going to get warmer, it's going to get wetter, particularly in the winter, and it's going to experience more extreme precipitation events. Okay, so let's start with warming temperatures. And just to orient everyone, the map on the left is showing kind of historical changes in winter. So we're talking about December, January, and February in average temperatures. And as we can see here, the state has warmed as a whole, with the northern part of the state experiencing warming of about 5 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 70 years. And then on the right, you'll see a map of change in average temperatures that's being projected by kind of a low middle emission scenario, comparing the climate normals for 1981 to 2010 with 2041 to 2060. And so this particular set of scenarios is projecting winter warming of about 3 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit for Wisconsin, especially with more warming happening in the northern part of the state. And so when we think about what this means for winter, as Hillary mentioned, the season's going to shrink, which means less time for winter-based recreation and associated snow and ice-related activities. In addition, warmer temperatures and resulting ecosystem response is going to lead to continued changes in the distribution of species across the seasons, which could have implications for things like birding, hunting, etc. So then if we move to kind of this projected increasing precipitation trend, all 9 climate regions of Wisconsin reported their wettest decades on record since the 2011 Wiki report, which is pretty astonishing. So as you can see here, again, the map on the left is showing historical change in winter precipitation from 1950 to 2019. And you can see that winter precipitation in Wisconsin has increased about 20% across the state. And then in terms of future projections, which again, we can see on the right, they're expecting to see, again, an increase in the winter in precipitation when you're looking at climate normals for 1981 to 2010, compared to kind of these mid-century projections. So while this might seem like some good news for winter snow-based activities, in combination with warming temperatures, we're expecting more winter precipitation to actually fall as rain rather than snow. And so according to these future projections, by the late 21st century, state average snowfall could actually be up to 50% less than what we're seeing historically, with the greatest effect on snow depth being in March. So that's one of kind of our shoulder seasons, but you know, the implications are still significant. Again, the greatest magnitude reduction in snowfall is expected to occur in the northern part of the state, which will mention things, again, as Hillary mentioned, like ski races, downhill skiing, and any other activities that require reliable and significant snowpack. And so snowmaking technology may be able to help offset some of these losses, but it's unlikely to match all of them, especially over the long term. As we know, snowmaking also requires certain temperature conditions, and so it won't be able to offset all of those losses. Okay, and then I don't have a winter specific focus map for extreme precipitation events, but high intensity rainfall events are also expected to get more frequent by mid-century. So events like these, as we're already seeing, are expected to lead to more frequent floods and washouts, which will be impactful not just in the winter, but also year-round. The heaviest rain events experienced in Wisconsin are expected to become 1.5 to 2 times more frequent by mid-century, which of course affects things like infrastructure, our coastal resources, and human health and safety, all of which are important factors in tourism and outdoor recreation pursuits. I also don't have a slide specifically on ice cover, but Hillary did a great job talking about how reductions in ice cover are going to lead to reduced kind of ice fishing access and also ice skating. And so I think continued education about ice safety are going to be important to preventing future accidents. The other thing in northern Wisconsin to think about is that the reduction in ice cover also reduces access to the mainland for island communities via ice roads, and also deteriorating conditions for things like the ice caves over in the Apostles, which has implications for tourism and outdoor recreation, but also beyond. So for example, the Madeline Island ferry service has already experienced strain due to reductions in ice cover on Lake Superior, and residents have experienced financial strain as a result of that. So overall, you know, these changes in climate are likely to increase expenses for tourism and outdoor recreation businesses, including from things like insurance, the need for backup power and water systems, and other emergency preparedness needs. And so, as Hillary also said, you know, there will be kind of these winners and losers when it comes to climate change, especially on the individual business level. Perhaps some of you have seen articles recently touting the Great Lakes as a climate refuge. And I think to some extent, this region is going to benefit from climate change and be more isolated from some of the most significant impacts. But again, of course, it's not going to be without suffering and costs. Okay, and so given this information, our working group is now focused on more thoroughly understanding how climate change is going to manifest for tourism and outdoor recreation in Wisconsin, particularly by season, and also using in-depth case studies from around the state. This isn't a small task because tourism is a $22 billion industry and outdoor recreation is a $7.8 billion industry in Wisconsin. In addition, these sectors are very diverse and encompass a lot of different types of services and activities, some of which might not even come to mind immediately. In addition to that, putting mitigation and adaptation strategies into effect isn't always easy, though I think there are already businesses that are making changes, even if it's not necessarily done under the auspices of climate change adaptation. So our group is getting ready to do some more targeted outreach around climate change with folks in the tourism and outdoor recreation industries, likely through interviews and focus groups. So in my last few minutes, I just wanted to touch on two areas in particular that Wiki is going about its work in a different way this time. So the first relates to climate justice. And so we, as a group, have already touched on how climate and racial justice issues intersect and overlapped. So I wanted to share a few steps that Wiki is taking to promote climate justice through its current and future work. These include what's outlined here. In particular, I wanted to note the second bullet point, and that's that we're really working to address environmental and climate justice issues throughout the report and really integrate it throughout the content. And okay, so that brings me to kind of the second change that I wanted to talk about, which is also a way that you can contribute to the Wiki report, and that's by sharing kind of your climate change stories. So what we're looking for here are ideas that demonstrate how climate change is having an impact and also help connect the science with what's happening across the state. And so to do this, you can submit as much or as little of this information to me or to other members of Wiki working group teams. And then I can share that with our Wiki science writer, who's going to be working on developing these narratives, which will then go on the Wiki website and be published alongside of the updated assessment report. And so I know we're a mixed audience with folks from Minnesota and Wisconsin and other areas, but I'd like to encourage folks to reach out to me no matter where you work or reside, if you have a compelling story to share. So even if it's not tourism and outdoor recreation focused, I can put you in touch with other working groups, as well as the science writer. And I was, just thinking now that perhaps there's also some benefit of just compiling these types of stories for Western Lake Superior as we work together on climate change and have future discussions around climate change as a group. In addition, if you have ideas or thoughts about how we can center issues of climate justice in this work, please also reach out. This is a big effort and one that would certainly benefit from your expert input. Okay. Okay. So finally, this is separate from Wiki, but an exciting opportunity that's coming up around climate change adaptation and outdoor recreation. So registration technically closed yesterday, but I think there's still potentially an opportunity to join the course if you're really keen on participating and have an interest in adaptation planning for recreation, as well as a project that you want to work on. And I know Kristen's here and can share more details about that. So if you have questions about that, feel free to jump in during our Q&A. Okay, and with that, I'm going to stop there. This is my contact information. Again, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to answer questions, find you more information, etc. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Natalie. What an excellent presentation. It's great to hear about Wiki's efforts, and it's an important model for all of us to hear about, and especially your work with the working group. So there's a question in the chat from Judy, and Judy asked, Natalie, is the city of Duluth going to participate in that workshop you mentioned? So I think that's referring to the the link we just shared, the Forest Adaptation Recreation Online Adaptation Planning Practices for Recreation Workshop?
That's a good question. Kristen, putting you on the spot. I don't know if anyone from the city of Duluth is participating.
Yeah, I don't think that we have any signups from Duluth right now. This is kind of an interesting workshop for us in that it's nationally focused. So we've got a really diverse, geographically diverse group right now, people from all over the United States, including a couple folks from Alaska, projects from Alaska participating. But if anyone from the city is interested, I'm happy to follow up with more detail.
Thanks, Kristen. So another question has come in. What are some things that outdoor recreation outfitters are doing to address winter recreation impacts?
Yeah, so kind of the immediate thing that comes to mind that I uncovered during my PhD work was expanding winter offerings. So thinking about adding snowshoes to kind of offerings in addition to skiing, since you can snowshoe in less snow than you can ski in. I think it's often hard for businesses to adapt to climate change because it's a big it's a big problem where you don't always feel like you have a lot of influence and power. So I think that, also adapting snowmaking technology and then thinking about things like emergency preparedness are all things that I've heard come up. And I think, or I'm hoping that through kind of this more intensive outreach to folks in Wisconsin, that we might hear about some other creative ways that outdoor recreation outfitters are addressing are using to address winter recreation. So if anyone else has things that they've heard about, please let me know and share. It would be awesome to be able to incorporate those into our report and our work.
Yeah, Hillary mentions that Lutsen and other ski areas have started to do the snowshoeing, it sounds like. And one thing that I've heard too is that the increase in folks that are getting out on fat tire bikes, expanding into the maybe less ideal skiing conditions. So if you have other questions for Natalie, I invite you can unmute yourself, raise your hand, ask your question verbally, or type it in the chat. And as we wait for other questions to come in, I'm going to use this time to kind of thank both of our presenters, thank Natalie and Hillary for sharing their time and expertise with us and their stories on our changing winters. We're going to put some links in the chat that will allow you to sign up for future notices and to see our recordings. Also, you'll get a recording in your inbox. If you got here today, you'll find a recording when it's ready. We look forward to seeing you at our next Twin Ports Climate Conversation, which will be on April 20th, and will feature Stephen Handler from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And Stephen will present on an assisted migration project with the Superior National Forest. So a great talk that we're looking forward to as well. You'll also see an email from us in the coming weeks. We're looking for some survey information from you, feedback on Twin Ports Climate Conversations, what's going well and what we can do better in the future. And we thank you in advance for taking the time to do the surveys. I know one more survey is always a lot to ask, but we hope that this information will shape the future of our work. So I'm still not seeing any other questions come in, so I think I get to ask mine. And this kind of relates to the last question, Natalie. Thinking about winter activities, and we talked about snowshoeing and other things that might be changing, but are there going to be changes that we're seeing other sports from maybe our fall and spring seasons kind of shift into winter? Will there be new recreation opportunities that we don't quite know of yet that will form in this in between as we're changing our winter conditions? Or what kind of information are you looking at when you're pulling that for your report? Are you seeing new activities or maybe things that we don't typically do up in the northern states but are becoming more popular?
Yeah, and Julie did make a comment in the chat about kind of expanding into the shoulder seasons. And I think also, some winter winter destinations are also thinking about summer activities too. But I did hear about something recently that sounded like it was a multi-sport event that's on your bike. So more like I can't even remember what it's called. Decathlon, not decathlon, but the event where where you might be skiing and then shooting archery. So now it seems like they're adapting that to the bikes, which I need to find out more about.
Oh, biathlon, yeah.
Biathlon, yeah, okay. So I did hear about that recently, but who knows? People are creative, so it'll be exciting to see what comes out in the future.
All right, well, we're about at 1 o'clock. Again, thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Hillary, and thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at a future Twin Ports climate conversation.